Good. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for Université de Lomé to welcome all panelists in the framework of the Fulbright Specialist Residency Program. This program is fitted out with a project entitled Toward a Digital Renaissance in Arts and Humanities Research and moderated by Dr. Jacqueline Cofield. Dr. Jacqueline Cofield is a professor at CUNY Hunter College and a joint teaching fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art. She holds a PhD from Columbia University, where her thesis examined the epistemologies and aesthetic practices of Black women artists. Welcome, Dr. Cofield. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agbo. Good afternoon to everyone who is joining us in person and online. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin, as always, by offering my sincere thanks to the U.S. Embassy here in Lomé, Togo, particularly the Department of Public Affairs, and also to the faculty of the University of Lomé, especially the Department of Anglophone Studies, for their continued partnership, care, and intellectual generosity throughout this speaker series. I've been having such a fabulous time in Togo, and I'm really, truly thankful. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Cofield, and I'm here as a Fulbright specialist working at the intersection of digital humanities, education, and global knowledge exchange. Today's session, number 9 of 10 that we're having in this digital humanities speaker series, brings us to a critical point in the series. Over the past weeks, we have explored archives, embodiment, storytelling, libraries, access, and artificial intelligence. A through line across these conversations has been the question of whose knowledge structures our fields and whose futures are being imagined through digital and pedagogical practice. African-centered pedagogies and post-colonial futures invites us to engage that question directly. This session centers African and Africana epistemologies not as alternatives or supplements, but as foundational frameworks for thinking about education, digital humanities, and global knowledge production. We are honored to be joined by 2 illustrious scholars whose work powerfully articulates these commitments. First, Dr. Roopika Risam is an associate professor of digital humanities and social engagement at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on data histories, ethics, and practices at the intersections of post-colonial studies, African diaspora studies, and digital humanities. Through projects such as the Pan-African Data Center and her foundational work in post-colonial digital humanities, she offers critical tools for understanding how digital infrastructures shape power, representation, and global futures. We are also joined by Dr. Lasana Kazembe, an Emmy award-winning poet, educator, and critical Black scholar. His work explores Africana sacred epistemologies, expressive forms, cultural memory, and radical pedagogy as sites of knowledge, social action, and world building. Drawing from Black intellectual traditions and global Black arts movements, his scholarship and creative practice model African-centered pedagogy as a living, sentient practice rooted in history, imagination, and struggle. Together, today's speakers invite us to think seriously about what it means to teach, research, and build futures from African-centered and post-colonial perspectives, especially within digital humanities and education. I invite you to listen today for how pedagogy becomes theory, how history becomes method, and how African and Africana epistemologies continue to shape the possibilities of global knowledge production. Thank you so much to our 2 speakers. We'll start with Dr. Kazembe, and then Dr. Risam will follow, and afterwards we will have our Q&A session. Thank you so much.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'll be ready to share my screen as soon as I'm able. We can make room. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to share this with you. I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to watch the time also. I'm going to be very mindful of time. My name is Dr. Lasana Kazembe. I am a professor of education and Africana studies at work at Indiana University in Indianapolis. And for the past the work that I do has taken place in schools, communities, juvenile detention centers, and prisons. So I do a lot of work around the arts. I do a lot of work around education, specifically urban education, and a lot of work around Africana history and culture. So this brief presentation is a spotlight of some of the work that I do. And what I want to do is highlight some of the uh, African-centered principles and cultural principles that go into the work. This is for us, it's always an exercise in history, and we can never honor those who came before us too much. For those who do not know Dr. Carter G. Woodson, we consider him the grandfather or the godfather of Black history here in the United States. One of his many books, he wrote 25 books. He said that real education inspires people to live more abundantly, to begin with life as they find it and commit themselves to making it better. So right off, we don't see any kind of separation between art and education, education and living. All of these things are connected. And we're brought here by history. So we never want to leave history. I'm always suspicious of people who leave history out of the things that they're doing, whether you're talking about an artist, whether you're talking about a teacher, whether you're talking about a philosopher. I'm very suspicious of people who leave history out, because it is through history, through the uh, rescue and reconstruction of our history, that we can set up the right kind of relationship that will allow us to sort of move in the present and then plot a future for ourselves. So I start off right off with an African concept we call Sankofa. Sankofa, this is an Akan concept, our brothers and sisters in West Africa, that symbolizes the quest for knowledge. And the implication here is that that quest is based on critical examination, constant critical examination, and then intelligent and patient investigation. So the symbology, the iconography of the Sankofa bird, its body faced in the present, its head turned around representing the past, and in its beak, you see the cosmic egg representing the future of the unborn generations. So wrapped up in this cosmology is the notion or the practice of past, present, and future, which is one. Say goodbye to the Sankofa bird. And then we see also another African concept that comes to us from our ancestors in the Northeast. You know it as Egypt, what we call it Kemet. And this is a Kemetic concept, Sia, that symbolizes the need for constant self-examination, deep reflection, and engaging in this ongoing synthesis with your identity, your disposition, your worldview, and then the practices that you enact in the world, how you move in the world. So Sia is an opportunity for us to see deeply and to sort of look within and to examine our practices. And we understand also that thought always informs and guides action, always. All right. This is a pyramid analysis that I created about 26 years ago. And this is I don't have time to go through all of this, but essentially, this is essentially a framework for understanding enormous amounts of information around particular phenomena. So we start with a thesis, we develop an antithesis, and then through a process of critical thinking, we engage a synthesis that is a refined way of thinking and looking at things. And it's never a finished product. So it's always sort of an ongoing synthesis. Okay. Interrelated zones of my work quickly. I work in three different zones. One zone is education. And in the world of education, I mean education for liberation, educating us not so that we just become filled up with names, dates, places, and faces and facts that we can't do anything with, but education in a practical sense. And of course, I'm a teaching artist and a poet and a spoken word artist. So arts learning and pedagogy is also at the heart of what I do. And then, of course, that Pan-African Black intellectual tradition, which is something that is alive and something that I've been studying and involved with for over 50 years of my life. So Dr. Marimba Ani gave us this guiding framework, and this comes from the Swahili. And she starts with looking at the culturally structured thought, which she called the utamawazo. Culturally structured thought is a method for determining the way in which people are socialized to perceive, to think, and to experience the world. In other words, if we're perceiving, thinking, and experiencing the world as free people, then we should express that thought through how we're socialized. On the other side, you see Utama Rojo. Utama Rojo represents the vital energy or the life spirit of a culture. It gives culture its emotional tone. It motivates the collective behavior of its members. So then as we move into that concept and out of that concept, we move to the other concept, asili, which it represents the culture, the essence of a culture. So these are cultural concepts that really apply to human cultural groups on the planet Earth, but I've applied them into my work. And of course, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of a theoretical framework for pedagogy, I invoke the framework that was articulated by Dr. Greg Carr, who was at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He came up with this 6-step Africana Studies framework that has to do with not only knowledge production, but also curriculum development, teacher planning, how we plan lessons, how we assess, how we organize classrooms and organize learnings. So social structure is essentially ask the question, who are Africans to other people? That is, how are people outside of African life and history seeing African people? The governance structure, this is a deeper question because it asks, how do African people organize themselves across space and time? How do they see themselves, not as objects, but as subjects in history? And then ways of knowing, what kinds of systems do African people develop to explain their existence and that address these fundamental issues of living? The fourth part of the framework deals with science and technology. This is stretching across the span of time. What types of devices and instruments that were developed in order to understand nature, to shape nature, human relationships, to advance us as a society? Movement and memory. How did and do Africans remember their experiences? What is our relationship with our own cultural memory? And then the sixth aspect of the Africana Studies framework, cultural meaning making. In other words, what specific music, art, dance, literature, etc. have we created? How have we put those things in the world, and what do those things come to mean as we educate and as we encounter new generations of people? So when we talk about culture, I talk about culture as both a condition and an outcome of existence. And when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, this is a major aspect of my work in pre-service teaching. I maintain that you cannot be a culturally responsive practitioner unless you're a culturally responsive thinker. In other words, it has to be in your mind first. So when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, we're talking about those practices, those modes of thinking and disposition that influence competency and methods, describing what should a teacher be doing in the classroom in order to be culturally responsive. So these questions are very, very key. How can culturally informed pedagogy create deeper learning opportunities? This is more than an exercise in feel-good history, trying to make people feel good about some history that's distant to themselves. It is about how can we, through our engagement with education, transform ourselves, and then how can we in turn transform society? So students learn more effectively if they understand how they learn and how to manage their own learning. So the formula is quite simple, is that we connect culture to students, and then students to academic excellence. I'm still invoking that pyramid model. So culturally responsive teaching had more so to do with the teachers and what sort of practices, what goes on in the classroom. Culturally responsive pedagogy, this speaks more to the internal things. What are your attitudes and dispositions? Culturally responsive pedagogy describes the posture that a teacher might adopt that when fully embodied would determine planning, instruction, and assessment. So this whole disposition, this attitude, in other words, how do you show up before you even begin to engage with other people's children, to engage and develop lesson plans, select texts, assess learning? How do you show up as an individual in this work? So Dr. Vivi Clark, she articulated a concept that she called teaching through culture. And as I said, my approach is different than what the standard approach is. The standard approach is to put or let's just put some culture in the curriculum. So let's be very sort of after the fact, and let's see culture as an addendum. I take the reverse process, and that is to put curriculum into the culture. So culture is the thing that is centered. And so Dr. Vivi Clark, she gave us this notion of diaspora literacy. This informs my work it always. And diaspora literacy refers to the ability to understand and or interpret the multi-layered meanings of stories and words and other folk sayings within any given community throughout the African diaspora. That is to say, invoking the pedagogical tenets and the dispositional tenets of diaspora literacy. One can go among our brothers and sisters in Haiti. One can go among African people who happen to live in the diaspora, who happen to live in New Orleans, or who happen to live in parts of the Caribbean. And you can, by dint of invoking the tenets of diaspora literacy, begin to develop an interrogation or an exploration of their local history. And then you can apply this. Heritage knowledge, this is another concept that factors into my Africana studies framework. And this essentially is group memory. That's what it refers to. Dr. Joyce King articulated this concept of heritage knowledge as curriculum built upon authentic knowledge construction that is informed by the Black intellectual tradition and an African episteme, right? And so I don't know, well, how it is here in the United States. Typically, when we engage the teaching of Black history, a lot of people want to start with slavery. And I don't have any problem with learning about slavery. I think it's very important. It is a major, major event, phenomena that it continues to impact us. However, the first Africans who came to the United States did not come as enslaved people. They came as free people and explorers. So when you start people's history with slavery, already you started in the wrong place, and then you've also started in the wrong time. Also, one other point here, a lot of times in the United States, people want to start the history of Black people's presence in the United States in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. Again, that's a chronological mistake because African people, and we have it documented, they were in the what's known as the United States. They were in this country a full century before and came into the area known as North Carolina circa 1500. So right off, when you start with the wrong premise and you start with the wrong chronology, it's going to be very, very difficult to sort of come back from there. That's why we need to ask these questions. So teaching culturally, I'll finish up here. Teaching culturally, these are just some of the ways that an Africana studies framework can be implemented throughout the curriculum. This Africana studies framework, the disposition, the thought process that goes into it manifests itself as teaching practices that include utilizing oral histories and storytelling, encouraging multiple ways of thinking, promoting analysis and discourse, a growth mindset in the work, encouraging students to understand personal sovereignty, and on and on and on. Another grandmaster, Dr. Geneva Gay, she articulated what she called the 6 dimensions of culturally responsive education. Education should be emancipatory and liberating. It should be transformative of schools and societies. So we, with this framework, do not regard schools as some isolated entities that are isolated away from humanity and reality. No, schools are very much a part of the social fabric, and it is very much a part of how people move and experience the world. Socially, emotionally, politically comprehensive. Education, culturally responsive education should validate every student's culture. It should be multidimensional, and it should be socially and academic empowering. I wanted to show you, this is a sister, I call her the Grand Master, Dr. Joyce King at Georgia State University. Her works have been, I think, at the core of the work that I've done over the past 20 years at least. Dr. Joyce King, I really, really urge you to check out her work. She says that we must become cognitively and emotionally free of the ideological constraints on knowledge, thought, and morally engaged pedagogy. So Dr. King gave us these, what she called the 6 culturally informed principles: collective humanity, critical consciousness, indigenous voice, accurate scholarship, representation, and of course, inclusion. All of these things, these are not mere categories, but connected to these principles are what she calls emancipatory pedagogy strategies. Okay, so all of them have a much, much, much deeper multi-dimensional aspect to them. That's Dr. King. So I'm going to close by essentially going over some of the pedagogical concepts that I've sort of introduced during this short session. I've talked about diaspora literacy and heritage knowledge. I've talked about, well, I've talked about pyramid consciousness, but I didn't talk about Black consciousness. Black consciousness comes to us for our brother, the late great Steve Biko in South Africa. He articulated African consciousness back in 1980. And then, of course, our brother in the Caribbean, the late great Dr. Walter Rodney, he gave us the notion of guerrilla intellectualism, meaning if you are in the academy, if you are a teacher, if you are a professor, whatever you are, you cannot, it is not enough for you to be isolated inside the academy. You have to be connected to the community, and you should put yourself in service to the people. Okay. And then the theory of valuation, that's our vanilla brother, Dr. John Dewey, who gave us this concept that things can be appreciated in their time and across time. These African cultural concepts that I mentioned, Utamaroho, Asili Nomo, Sia, Utamawazo, and Saruj Ta. I'll mention Saruj Ta because that comes to us from Kemet or from Egypt. And the concept of Saruj Ta essentially means raising up the good constantly. Okay. And everything is sort of bookended by Ma'at. And Ma'at is another system of spiritual values. And it's a really kind of a spiritual pedagogy that comes out of ancient Kemet that represented through the 7 principles of truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, propriety, and reciprocity. So I'm going to end there, and thank you very much for listening, and happy to engage with you for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Kazembe, for this wonderful presentation. So much to think about, so many gems and fire bombs you dropped on us for us to marinate on as we move forward. So now we will have the presentation of Dr. Risam.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cofield, for the invitation to join everybody today, and to Kathini for wrangling all of us. I want to tell you about what I mean by postcolonial digital humanities, which is a key concept in my research, and show you what some of that work might look like, using examples of my own digital humanities projects, to show how theory can design our can influence our design decisions. So postcolonial digital humanities offers an approach to creating digital forms of scholarship that examines how colonial histories shape how we produce knowledge, and crucially, how those structures can be resisted and reconfigured. And so what I'm advocating for is not simply thinking about, how do we use digital tools or digital platforms or archives, but how are they shaped by long histories of empire and of extraction and of hierarchy? So in other words, and this very much resonates with Dr. Kazembe's presentation as well, the digital is not outside of history, and it inherits history. So postcolonial digital humanities embraces a set of values that matter deeply for how we work: attention to power, a commitment to particularity, and an orientation towards transformation. So power first, because digital systems themselves, the tools we use and engage with all the time, or whether for creating knowledge, are not neutral. In digital humanities, tools and methods for research, whether for text mining or creating a digital map or creating a digital archive, are often treated as containers for knowledge, but they're better understood as systems that make decisions about knowledge. So the kind of data you create for an object you put in a digital archive determines who can find it and if they can find it in the words that they use to understand it. Decisions about platforms determine who can contribute and under what conditions. Algorithms sort and rank and privilege certain kinds of materials over others, often in ways that appear objective, but actually reflect deeply embedded values. And those values often marginalize archival materials and the histories of communities that have historically been marginalized. And visualization, data visualization often acts like we are transparently displaying information, but actually that's an interpretive act that highlights certain relationships and obscures others. So postcolonial digital humanities insists that these decisions are not merely technical, they are intellectual and they are political, and they shape what becomes visible and legible and authoritative when we create digital components of our cultural record. Particularity next, because concepts like archives and data or the global are frequently treated as universal, but they are actually historically and culturally situated. So much of digital humanities scholarship inherits assumptions from European and North American contexts about what kinds of categories we should use to describe groups of people or their experiences, often in English language. And postcolonial studies instead, postcolonial digital humanities instead asks, what do we do when we know those assumptions don't hold? We're dealing with fragmentary archives, archives shaped by histories of colonialism and violence. The data that comes out of post-colonial contexts and in the diaspora do not necessarily conform to standardized schemas, and nor should they have to, because we are working with histories that are shaped by displacement, suppression, and collective memory. And are working in an environment in digital humanities that privileges institutional record keeping, and that record keeping keeps out so many people's stories. So attending to particularity isn't about rejecting creating standards, but recognizing that we must create ones that are relevant to the communities from which in which culture is produced, and only with the participation of the people whose culture is being represented. And finally, transformation, because the goal of postcolonial digital humanities is not just to add more content or make it more diverse. We're not trying to leave underlying systems intact. Rather, we have to ask how those systems themselves must be rethought. How should we model data to be able to represent the particularities of the histories represented within it? And so we don't want to extend the inherited hierarchies in the methods of digital humanities, but instead treat design of a project as a site where we can intervene and can articulate how digital scholarship should be created differently to respond to the specific materials that are under consideration. A recurring challenge in digital humanities is that often innovation is equated with technical novelty or with scale, like really big projects or really complex projects. Often the impulse in digital humanities is to look at what other people are doing and looking at what the trends are and jumping on that bandwagon. That's why when you talk to most digital humanists right now, they'll tell you they're working on AI. Instead, I argue that we should really be focused on the research questions and on the care with which decisions about how we create digital archives or digital maps must be made. So, and in that case, postcolonial digital humanities intersects with the work I've done on something called minimal computing, which advocates for an approach to designing digital humanities projects that only uses the necessary and sufficient methods or tools for your research question. So instead of asking, what platform should we use? What method is trending now? We want to ask, what is it that we really need to accomplish? Right? What kind of stories are we trying to tell? So rather than starting from a tool, starting from the stories and from the questions. The next is what do we already have? And the purpose of this question is to try and avoid starting from a deficit, starting from, oh my gosh, I don't have access to a supercomputing cluster, or I don't have, endless access to money. Instead, we want to start thinking of, what kind of knowledge do the people we're collaborating with, or do we ourselves have? What kinds of institutional community resources can be used to tell stories about ourselves and our communities? And this matters because it reframes digital humanities as something that can be built out of existing capacities rather than something that requires a kind of abstract set of ideal conditions determined by somebody else about what you need to actually be able to start doing this kind of work. The next question is what must we prioritize? And so, of course, every project involves trade-offs. And so this question is intended to make those trade-offs explicit. Are we prioritizing readability, or are we prioritizing a particular kind of computational approach? Are we prioritizing participation of the people who might help build a project over technical efficiency, or thinking about longevity over novelty and the sustainability of a project? And these aren't secondary decisions. They actually shape who can work with us, who can engage with us, who can be part of telling stories with digital tools and with data, how it'll be used, and how long they will last. And then finally, what are we willing to give up? Because no project can do everything and everything you want. That because constraints, whether they're infrastructural or financial or based on time, make that clear. So being explicit about what we are willing to give up allows us to resist the pressure to pursue a maximalist design that may be unsustainable or misaligned with our goals. And so these questions force us to treat design decisions as intellectual ones and to resist the idea that there is one correct or universal way to do digital humanities. There really isn't. There really isn't. So with that in mind, I want to turn to 3 projects of my own that illustrate these ideas in practice. The first is Reanimate, which is an open access digital publishing project that creates digital editions of writing by women in media industries whose work has been overlooked. So we create digital editions that people can read and download and teach. And Reanimate grew out of a very specific problem, which is that there's a substantial body of work by women, especially women of color, in media industries that is unpublished and it's out of print, or it's only in archives that you have to physically go visit to see. And when my colleague Carol Stabile at the University of Oregon wanted to publish a print edition with the university press of writing by some of these women, the publishers repeatedly told her there was no market for it because nobody had ever heard of them, which presents an interesting problem because if you can't publish it because no one's heard of them, how's anybody going to hear about them unless we're able to disseminate their work? And so when Carol came to me with this problem, I said, well, let's do this ourselves. Let us create a mechanism for publishing their work. And so we did that. And so you can see here an edition of writing by Freddie Washington, a Black actress in the US who wrote for the People's Voice, a newspaper in Harlem during the 1940s. She was very much an activist on questions of labor and race in Hollywood and on Broadway. And so we've basically created, we transcribed and we edited and made available all of her writing from the People's Voice. And so when we were thinking about the trade-offs, we wanted it to just be available and readable as easily as possible. And so we decided not to do particular things digital humanists might do, like mark up the text with a method called text encoding. We decided we were going to just edit it. We're going to make it available. It's going to be in flat files on a platform that people don't need to stay connected to the internet to use. So we're thinking about students on the subway who might not have access, might be reading as they commute to school. And so really we gave up certain things to meet our core goals, which was to make these women's writing available to new audiences. So the irony of that project is after we started it, the publisher that said to Carol, we can't publish those works, asked us to do a edition, which they printed and published with these women's work because we had demonstrated that now there was a value to these people that was legible in market terms. And the project demonstrates that really meaningful digital scholarship doesn't mean you have to wait for somebody to give you a whole lot of money or the exactly perfect tools, but instead really clear priorities and a willingness to build. The second project is the Global Du Bois, which is a collaborative digital humanities project that uses data visualization and mapping to explore W.B. Du Bois's global intellectual networks. Let me put it back for a sec. At its core, the Global Du Bois challenges the prevailing narrative about Du Bois's biography, which says that sort of early in his life, he was concerned with African American freedom struggles, and then he turned his back on African American freedom struggles in favor of decolonization movements, which is totally not true. All throughout his career, we see him seeing a mutual relationship between African American freedom struggles and civil rights and decolonization for countries in Africa as well as other, and he's very interested in India and in the Caribbean as well. So this project is intended to try to find ways to use data to visualize his political and intellectual trajectories. And so you can see the first main map, which is called Du Bois GPS, and it maps more than 700 places where Du Bois lived and worked and lectured or organized across the Americas, countries in Africa, many at that time colonies, Europe and Asia. And each location is linked to biographical, geographical, and time-based data, as well as citations. So it gives researchers, students, and Du Bois aficionados new ways to explore his movements and the context that shaped them. And so the map offers a framework for studying how his life connected Black freedom struggles in the U.S. with anti-colonial and later internationalist movements around the world. And so it's an experiment in method, an attempt to see what does it mean to see Du Bois through data, recognizing that data can be inherently flattening and asking how we can use it to illuminate networks of movement and exchange that shaped his world. The third project is the Pan-African Data Project, which brings together historical research and digital methods to trace the people, organizations, and events that have shaped Pan-Africanism since the late 19th century and continue into the present. Through data curation and data visualization, the project highlights the global networks of Black liberation and solidarity that link Africa and its diasporas. So we drew on archival and scholarly sources to curate data sets of people who attended Pan-African events and participated in organizations that were influential in shaping Pan-African thinking. We then created a database and developed a website to allow visitors to explore the data. And I'm just going to show you the site. Nope. Next slide. Here you go. So this is the homepage. And so the data can be searched by events, by people, by organizations, and there's maps and there's timeline views and also tabular views of the data. This is an example of the events. So running down the left-hand side, there are different events and you can click on one and it gives you information about the event, its dates, when we know, how many delegates we know were there, citations to our research, then panels for known participants, people we know so far have been able to document have attended. And you can click on any one of those people. So here's Amy Ashwood Garvey. It shows you where they're from and then gives you information on them, as well as the events they participated in, the organizations they were active in, and the places that were connected to them. And then you can click on them, view details, and get a full page of information about the people in the project. There's people explorers and event explorers, so organization explorers. This is people, so you can filter the data. So say you want to see who are the women here, and so you can click on the filter and it gives you the women, and then we can say, okay, let's find out who are the women from Togo who were involved. So by navigating the site, and then get information about them. So right now we only have one, but hopefully as the research continues, we'll have more people. So we're not really trying to provide a ready answer, but really we're prioritizing helping scholars studying Pan-Africanism, and sharing the information with anyone interested in the topic, and to really hope for it to be more participatory beyond the initial collaborators who worked on it. I briefly want to touch on generative AI and agentic coding because it's increasingly part of how digital work gets done. So here is a visualization of events from the Pan-African Data Project. The yellow dots are the events, and the diamonds, the green diamonds, are people. So I did this in a half hour with Codex, which is OpenAI's agentic AI model for coding, using the D3 JavaScript library for data visualization. If I can actually do this myself, it would have probably taken about a day to make this myself, versus a half an hour. But I was really curious over the weekend about how good is agentic coding, and I was pretty surprised that it's pretty decent. There are many excellent critiques of generative AI, not the least of which are the environmental impacts on water access and carbon emissions, and along with other technologies of e-waste and extractive mining for rare metals, which disproportionately affects communities in African countries, as well as in India and in China. So if you're a person who says, I will absolutely not use this thing because it is an abhorrent, immoral thing, I completely understand and I respect that. And I personally tend to do things without automating them, because the process of creation and doing it manually is actually integral to how I think. But at the same time, agentic coding potentially lowers barriers of entry for creating digital scholarship, and people are using it. So it would have been vaguely irresponsible for me to pretend like that isn't actually happening. And I don't have really the answers yet on kind of what I think about it, but I think it amplifies design decisions about the kind of prompts, defaults, and training data and the assumptions built into these tools. And so all of these questions we want to ask ourselves about, whose knowledge is being valued, whose categories are being used to create these tools of generative AI, whose values are embedded in them, apply here. And so I think there's a good critique to be made about that. So I just want to end by pulling together a few takeaways from what I've shown today, and talked about. That decisions about platforms and data and visualization are intellectual and political choices. That sustainable digital futures depend on creating projects that enable collective participation, and can shape what future scholars may be able to ask and to research. And that the future of the field will be shaped by deliberate design decisions made today and made by you. So thank you so much, and I am looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Risam. I'm giving you some confetti in the Zoom space. This has been so incredibly enriching. I just want to make sure that we bring our spotlight to also add Dr. Lasana There we go. Okay. So first, I just want to sort of meditate on what we're holding, what just happened here. You've shared so much with us, and I'm really energized by both of your presentations and how you give us so much to work with as we prepare to move forward. Dr. Kazembe, you give us so many frameworks. You give us this idea that we really need to have a lot of pre-work before we jump into this work, right? We have to think about our intentions, do some reflexive, some self-assessments, and understand who we are in this work and why we're here. And then we need to prepare. And that means that we need to look inside ourselves, inside of our own communities. And also we need to understand, as Dr. Risam is also sharing with us, the context that we're entering into, and the histories and the power and the ways that power has shaped these histories, as opposed to just going into this field of digital humanities, accepting things as sort of as they are. And both of you energize us to feel agentic in this process, right? That we not need to only be consumers of this content, what's already happening, but that we need to be thinking as creators. And Dr. Risam, you've just shared with us so many examples of your own practice. You are a scholar practitioner, both of you, a model for that. You have both created so much as you've taken in, you're taking in and your output as well. So what I'm holding from today's conversation is this deep insistence that knowledge is shaped long before it reaches a syllabus, an archive, or a digital interface. Dr. Kazembe's presentation, drawing intentionally on a diasporic lineage of scholars, including Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Veve Clark, Joyce King, Greg Carr, Stephen Biko. I mean, this was a very international intellectual traditions that you have brought together. And I just really appreciate you including all of these voices, also Dr. Rodney, from different places in the diaspora, intellectuals from different places in the diaspora. And so this models for us how African-centered pedagogy is a collective intellectual inheritance, right? That we need not just be looking at our own location, geography. We need not be bounded by these boundaries, which are often colonial boundaries, right? That we need to be thinking diasporically as in gathering our intellectual traditions diasporically as we begin to do this work. And your framing of culture is both a condition and an outcome of lived experience, and pedagogy as posture rather than technique underscores how our worldview, how we're seeing the world in our emotional life, our memory, and our futurity are already embedded in educational practice. Dr. Risam's work extends this insistence into digital humanities, reminding us that digital is not outside of history. Everything is situated. Everything is being produced in a context with assumptions and biases already embedded. And so we need to approach all of this work with an inquiry-based approach. Her critique of inherited and fragmented archives and trend-driven adoption of tools challenges us to see design, data modeling, and visualization as interpretive and ethical acts. And I do appreciate that you use the word care. And the first week I did a presentation about entitled Digital Humanities as Care Work. So I really appreciate that. In our last week, this word care is coming up again as you've talked to us about your work. And so her emphasis on care, participation, minimal computing, right? Because we have this tendency to feel like we need in the digital humanities or in technology spaces at large to think that we need that more is better. But you remind us that maybe we need to slow down, and maybe sometimes less is more. And building from existing capacities, which also Dr. Kazembe is showing us, and we've talked about this in our first week, that we can start where we are. We don't have to start, as you mentioned, from a deficit point of view, particularly in places in the diaspora where we may not have all the resources that other places do have, but we do have things, and we can use those, and we can remix them as well. And we can also use our own histories and intellectual traditions as well. So there's so much that we already have to start with. And I think that's something that you both remind us of. And that echoes what themes that we've heard across this series, from archives to libraries to embodiment and AI, especially the responsibility we carry when we work with collective memory. So together, your presentations ask us to slow down, to be intentional about our beginnings, and to recognize that we are not simply inheritors of systems, but we are agents. And as Dr. Risam close with your final words, saying that you, all the students in the audience and all of us, we are the future of reshaping this future digital humanities. So I want to start with my first question, and I want to also encourage those in the audience, both online and in person, to begin to prepare your questions. I'm going to put this first question in the chat so that both of you can see it. So both of you emphasize that where and what we begin with really matters. Whether in curriculum design, data encoding, or data structures, how do you determine a responsible starting point when working with these histories shaped by colonial disruption? And what signals do you look for that a starting point needs to be rethought?
I'm happy to start, and to say that for me, it starts with the people. And I'm very much conscious of this because I'm of South Asian descent. My family is from Kashmir, and I I found in Pan-African thought ways of putting into words things that had always sort of bothered me about the world, and then very much felt influenced by it, but also I'm not of African descent. And so being someone who works in this space and it's not my lived experience has made me very much aware of the importance of collaboration. So with the Pan-African Data Project, for example, like I don't want to own that, right? I don't want to own the data. It's not mine. And so when I was sort of interested in the project, I was sort of looking for who else sort of works in this space, who does have those connections, and how can I collaborate with them? And so I worked with folks at the African American Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Maryland, who are doing really tremendous work. And so, we worked together on a lot of like conceptualization of the project, and I worked with students and, had students coming into the project. And it's also intended to be something that, if any of you, if you work in this, do research in this area and are interested in potentially, collaborating, that's also something that we really want, because it should be polyvocal. It should not be one person. It should not be two people. It should really be a collective. And so that's it for me, really. It is the sort of, are the right people there with the right blend of expertise, thinking specifically about digital humanities. Often we just talk about expertise in terms of like the technical expertise, but the technical expertise like shouldn't even be brought into the question if we don't have the people who are the stewards of the knowledge, right? And so that is for me that. And I think in terms of when I'm going to stop on that one and think about when do I need to rethink and give space to Dr. Kazembe.
Yeah, thank you for that response and for the question. I think for me, a responsible starting point is really exploring the question, how does it free us? Sonia Sanchez asked that question in 1974. She said it ironically, though, how do it free us? In other words, is this an enterprise that is liberatory, or is it something that is vanity? And so if it's something that's vanity, then it will have a quick shelf life. But if it's something that's liberatory, it's going to be rooted in love, or what I call a love praxis. It's going to be rooted in understanding and taking seriously where we are right now and where we need to go, and also understanding the need to be adaptable. That is how the most successful cultures over time have flourished, is their ability to adapt to environment, adapt to circumstance, etc. So I start there, I right there, and it is for the second part of the question. Um, what when it needs to be rethought, I think, is when the more base and pedestrian aspects of it are the ones that are celebrated the most. In other words, the uh, agree what we call often it's called acceptable blackness or corporate history, where you see the same names repeated over and over and over and over, and really no deep interrogation of them. It's just that we need to say the name Phyllis Wheatley. We need to say the name Harriet Tubman. Put her on a $20 bill, maybe if we need to say the name Dr. King. And so that is a sort of a non-reflective so when I see things like that, and then they're so celebrated and incentivized and monetized, that's a signal to me that's. And then I also, after you have asked the question that Dr. Amos Wilson used to have us ask, is that if you want to understand a problem, don't study who suffers from it, study who benefits from it. So who is at the end of that celebratory of the non-reflective, who's benefiting from it? And so when we ask those kinds of questions, that might be a good place to put a pin and then do a reassessment and plot a different course.
This makes me think about, and related to answering the when to rethink question. Um, this makes me think about the fact that, so when I work with students on projects, my kind of guideline in my head is they should benefit more from it than I do. And it should not be that I have students working for me and I get to just like walk away and be the person with the project, and the students did all the work, which they don't, but they do. I need to be investing time in their development and in their thinking and in their growth, such that it would actually be easier for me to do it myself. And usually it is. Like, it would be way easier for me to do a lot of these things myself, but I want them to be opportunities for students to learn and to get invested in doing this kind of work. And then along those lines, going back to the idea of who you're working with, I mean, for me, you know, uh, if I ever do a project and it involves working with communities. So I worked with a community in Massachusetts doing a history of a house, and the house had all this lore around it about, being given by a kind master to his formerly enslaved person. And when I heard this story, I was like, well, this is clearly garbage. So we need to work on this one. And the people who I was working with had come to me and said, can you help us like do this research? And so, you know, for me, when I work with community partners, it's like the community it has to really come from them, right? I want to be invited into it and not be like showing up being like, I'm here to like answer your questions or solve your problems. I want to be invited in, and then sort of at any moment where the people I am working with like don't want to do it or don't feel it's right, like that, those are key moments to rethink. And so I get this question a lot from people who want to do community engaged work. And they're like, but what if the community doesn't want to do it? And I'm like, well, then why are you even trying to do it? Right? I mean, that's very strange and savory and that power dynamic of like being somebody who works in an academic institution, like going into the community, like with all this knowledge. No, 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 no. We start from like, there is expertise there. Does the community want something you have to offer? Because it's not like you have all the answers or even, any of the answers.
I love that. You both remind us that we're constantly learning alongside each other. And, when we're talking about digital humanities, I mean, humanities, we have to remember it's at the center of humanities is the human, the human experience. And so, how is this helping the human? How are we benefiting? Who is benefiting? All of this matters. And it's, and what I'm hearing from you both is that these are, that we have to approach the answer to this question with thinking about care, right? Because you're, as you mentioned, Dr. Risam, you're entering into a space where maybe you are not a member, but we welcome you, because first of all, we are, as we say in French, on est ensemble. We're all, we're all together, and we're going to learn from each other in this love praxis. Brian Jones wrote a book called Black History is for Everyone. And so these histories, particularly of Indigenous people and colonized people worldwide, they bring us together, and we can learn from and empower each other. And that is, part of our strength. So thank you both for these answers. So my next question, I'm going to put it in the chat. And then next I'll go to the audience. So both of you critique fragmentation of archives, disciplines, histories, identities. What do you see as the intellectual or cultural consequences of fragmentation? And where have you seen, or would you like to see, successful attempts to resist it? And I know, Dr. Risam, you've shared with us several examples of work you've created that I'm already seeing as examples of these attempts to resist it. But I'm just wondering if you can point us in other directions as well for future insights.
Dr. Kazembe, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. I thought that was pitched to you. That's why I was quiet. Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I think you ask about the intellectual and cultural consequences of it. I think about the parts of the story that we don't get and that we don't have access to. So that can lead to, and has in many instances, to a sort of a leaving behind or disrespect of an entire swath of a population. So, for example, with Dr. Carter G. Woodson, really never talked about Black history. His insistence was that we study, talk about, teach about Blacks in history. So what you call Black history is really nothing more than the missing pages of world history. So right off, when you fragment or you sort of parse off pieces of the history, and then you elevate other parts of it, that it leaves a lot of gaps in the learning, and also leaves a lot of gaps in terms of how the quality of the relationship, the fidelity of the relationship that we're supposed to have. On the other side, you both, I'm sure, and others have maybe heard the term feel good history. There's another aspect to this on the other side where we often want to aggrandize, and we want to say, well, we never did, as African people, we never did anything wrong, and that everything that we ever touched was magnificent and perfect and all of that. That too is a problem, because I think that is a kind of a fragmentation, and really a kind of a vaingloriousness that is also dangerous. It's also anti-intellectual, and I think it's also culturally inauthentic. So we need to really guard on both sides, that we're asking the right questions, that we have the right sort of orientation, that we're rooted in the right ways, and that we understand what the outcomes are, because we're doing what we're doing for the people that are coming behind us. You know what I mean? We came and found a foundation, and we stood on it, and hopefully we're going to try to build on it. If I can be just really um, a little selfish, I'm very excited right now because me and four colleagues at Indiana University, we just received a $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation for a project that we call Black Humanities in the Midwest. And so our multi-year project will be essentially looking at Black populations in the 12-state region of the United States across time, like when those Black feet first got to that area of the country up until right now. That's our chronology. And we're also looking at those 12 states, but we're not just looking at so-called African Americans. We're also looking at the diasporic populations that are there, Minneapolis, Somali people. I'm from Chicago, lots and lots of Nigerian people in Chicago, lots of Haitian people. The city of Chicago was founded by a Black Haitian man. You know what I'm saying? So over time, we're going to be developing public facing events, Lycia, um, uh, uh, position papers, monographs, pageants, exhibit, all manner of things in the Black humanities along the lines of philosophy and ethics, history, economics, movement formation, institution building, on and on and on. So all of what was shared today, specifically the stuff that I said, but also the things that Dr. Risam said that I totally resonate with, and then the things that I'm drawing from your questions, Dr. Cofield, these are things that are top of mind for us as we engage the work now and across the next 5 years and beyond.
Congratulations. That's fantastic. I'm so excited to see what you do.
Congratulations. Very exciting.
I
Dr. Risam, did you want to, okay.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, I would just say I think that the intellectual and cultural consequences is that we don't feel like there is a place for us. And I say we in this case because what we do share is having lives that have and families whose histories have been shaped by colonialism. And in many ways, the challenges to the fragmentariness of the histories of our respective cultures have been impacted by colonialism. And then when we walk into an academic field like digital humanities, and we see, as I did, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, everything seemed to be celebrating all of these well-known, like white European or white North American people who everybody had already heard of. And I really felt like, well, where is there a place to talk about the people who I think people need to know about? And that actually has motivated my own research, because I don't want other people to come into digital humanities and feel that way, because it's very disorienting. And I had a lot of colleagues who were also like, well, why does that matter? And I'm like, but of course it matters. That's ridiculous. And so that to me is a consequence that any single one of us would perhaps not feel like there was a point of entry, that there was work that looked like things that we cared about, that there was work that we felt like we could be in conversation with. And I do feel like, in small ways, there have been changes to that in digital humanities. There is work I've done with the digital consortium, which was funded by Mellon. Also, there's work from the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective, which has a lot of work that is transnational, even beyond Caribbean. And so I hope that is slowly changing, and that people are starting to feel like they do find a way in.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I'm very interested in digital humanities is just for that very reason that you're talking about, Dr. Risam. The public-facing aspect of digital humanities I find so important in countering this fragmentation, and allowing us to be, in different continents, in different places, different geographies, and to tap in and feel connected, and to feel seen and not invisibilized, and feel that we also can contribute. And so it's so important. And I appreciate both of your answers on that. So I do have more questions, but I will open up to the audience. Do we have questions in the audience, online or in person? Emarine, I see your hand up online. You can unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening, good morning. Please, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Marine Tosaronso, and I'm a student in master's program at Université de Lomé, especially in the Faculty of Language, Letters, and Art. So thank you very much for the speakers for your bright, presentations. But I have two questions actually. I'll put it first in the chat, and then let me put it in the chat here. So the first question is this. So my first question is this, how can African-centered pedagogies reshape digital humanity curricula globally? Like it impacts global impact. How can it reshape, okay, globally? So the second question is that, in what ways can digital tools help recover and empower marginalized voice in African intellectual traditions? So these are my questions. I would like you to elaborate more on it. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. This is like class. That's a heavy question. Well, one of the things I'm thinking about is how the documentation and the how we document the world and how we document histories in the world. It's unfinished. And just as there is a great deal more exploration and mapping that that we have to do of the ocean floor, because we've only discovered like 3% of the ocean, the same is true for African history and African culture. And I say that because over the last, say, 1,000+ years, there has been so much misinformation and disinformation. And we've had to, spend a lot of time correcting myths and stereotypes and untruths and everything. And so one of the things that is that I think we're ready for it to do is to make room for what Dr. Chancellor Williams used to call that other African. All right. It is that other African, the science of Africa. I love comic art. I love comic books. I love fiction. Wakanda, Black Panther is a beautiful story, right? But where is the real science of Africa? Where is the story about the African Hesi-Ra who discovered diabetes in the 5th century BC? Where is the story about Lady Possession, who in the ancient world around 2400 BC was a female physician, a surgeon, but also the head of a guild of female surgeons? So there's so much more that we can sort of grab and go after, and then use our skills as technologists, use our skills as contemporary or modern storytellers, use what we know about pedagogical concepts, use what we know about the development of youth minds in terms of how youth take in information. They're not going to sit and read a 300-page book. This is a very image-driven culture where people listen with their eyes, right? So we can use a lot of the techniques that we've learned and go back and do a serious, sustained, long-term historical recovery project. And I think that because of the fact that we're talking about doing something digital and doing something that's say internet based, it can have this propagation all over the world. So there's a lot there that needs to be sort of recovered, reconstituted, and then reconveyed to the people.
I'll just follow up on that and say that, what I love about digital humanities is that it's really anything you want it to be, as long as digital and humanities. And therefore, and there's sort of a joke in the field that's sort of like, oh, what actually is it, right? And there are many people spent many years, and I am one of them, like trying to define what it is. But in reality, it really is like, anything you do that takes technology and takes culture and puts them together and something magical and new can happen when you do that. And so I've tried to sort of embrace that as a space where any one of us can intervene and bring our knowledges and our histories, our stories, our expertise um, into that space. Um, I with Kelly Baker Josephs, who's one of the leaders of the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective, I co-edited a volume called The Digital Black Atlantic. And it's open access, so anybody can go online and read it. And there's a really wonderful essay by Dr. Abdul Al-Kalimat called the Sankofa Principles. I was actually excited to listen to your presentation, Dr. Kazembe, because it was reminding me of that essay. And it's really, it's one example of thinking through what does it mean to bring an African-centered perspective into digital humanities. And it actually, what I think Dr. Al-Kalimat does really well in this essay is actually be like, hey, we've been doing this for a really, really long time. And it's true. He's absolutely correct. And he provides the receipts that this work has been going on. And so there are traditions to tap into and draw on and be part of and to extend and to reimagine. And then sort of then practically, because digital and humanities can be many things, it means, if you're working on a writer and you can legally make their work available, you can create a website, right? And it can be your edited collection. You don't have to, like, there's no magic, there's nothing special you have to do. You just have to like think about kind of how are you going to do it? What do you want to do? How do you want to frame it? How do you want to, contextualize it? All those intellectual things we do with our work anyway. But that it doesn't have to be what anybody else thinks digital humanities should be. And there's a real like power in that.
Absolutely. And speaking of websites, I've been working with 4 graduate students here as interns, and they have produced a website for this speaker series. So I'll be sharing that with you all very soon because it became evident to us that we're talking about archiving, we're talking about digital humanities. We need to actually archive this project and the work that has been done here. So that is coming soon. It already looks really beautiful, and it's their first time. So for everyone in the audience, they had not made a website, and the website that they have made is so beautiful, and and they just jumps right in. So thank you for that. Okay, I see another question online from Love Jamasi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacqueline, and thank you to our speakers for doing justice to the topic on board. My question stems from, I'm Lolonyo Jamesi from IU Bloomington, Indiana University at Bloomington, probably less than 1 hour, 30 minutes drive from Dr. Kazembe. My question stems from a perspective of a student. In this era where everything is about STEM and cultural studies, humanities are being relegated. I think those in the US universities can relate better, and Dr. Kazembe can speak to that better. How do we, those in this humanities field and then cultural studies, pitch ourselves to the developmental agenda, especially in Africa? Because the narrative is about how do we develop? And then when people think about development, the only thing that comes to mind is STEM. How do we, cultural studies students, humanities students, pitch ourselves to be involved in the narrative and debate concerning development?
The question you're asking is, how do cultural studies students teach themselves to be active participants in a debate, the ongoing debate about human development?
How do we pitch ourselves that we matter, our expertise matter in the developmental debate on the continent of Africa and the diaspora as well?
Right on. Well, I think as an approach to that, I think it's very important to understand that we're in the world at a time that's far different than how I grew up. I grew up on the cusp of the analog and digital age, but this is the straight digital age now. And there are lots and lots and lots of distractions in the world, far more than, especially for young people. And so one of the things that we have to do, I think, and this is the responsibility of each generation has to introduce itself to its own history. And you have to introduce yourself to your history in a way that is not surface, but it has to be an introduction that is based on love, that is based on longevity, and that is based on an outcome that may or may not be, popular. You know what I mean? And so it is the responsibility, I think, that we have, that we're supposed to have the sort of relationship with our own history, that we can see our history as a weapon and a direction of struggle. It is not, Prophet Muhammad used to say that if a man is not going to treat you right, then that man is also not going to teach you right. So for far too long, we have turned over the teaching and the work, the heavy work of trying to introduce us to ourselves. We've turned that over to other people. That is our responsibility, I think. And so all of us have, we all have here, and we know people like this, we all have the capacity to read and to study, and we have the capacity to ask questions. We need to sort of turn that, I think, into something of a project, a personal project that has a long shelf life, and it's something that we commit ourselves to, and it is something also that we do not for ourselves per se, but for the people, because I'm always thinking generationally. We have to think about the generation that's coming behind us, because some of us, we gotta, we can count the number of years we have left, probably, some of us, speaking personally. So we always have to ask, are we, what are we doing for other people? Last point I'll make is that the why. And this is something that I think I work with a lot of young people all the time in schools. I train people to become teachers. So I'm in a teacher education program. And one of the things that I'm always telling pre-service teachers, that you have to explain to students why. Like if we talk about, there's an African physician named Hesirah who discovered diabetes in 2600 BC. Okay, why is that important to me? And so when we start with why, or we involve the why in terms of the teaching, then that's an invitation for students to become sort of more self-conscious agents of their own education. So they may not care about the 1960s or the 1850s, or well, Ghana in 1954 got its independence from the British. They may not care about that. But what if you grounded it in their own personal family? So maybe they will care, maybe you may not care about 1960, but what was your grandmother doing in 19, you know what I mean? So if we can begin personalizing things like that, we can begin sort of engaging the heart and the mind simultaneously. And so why do that? Because we have this rich, beautiful, sustaining, life-giving genealogy. Genealogy is a people's relationship to ideas that bind them together. So it is of value, and it is very important to introduce our people to their genealogy, not just the genealogy, but also the possibilities of that genealogy, you know. And so this is something, and it's a we dealt a bad hand because we have to do it as a people who are simultaneously under siege. Society hands out and passes out daily aggression where to the point where we can't often even be ourselves without offending people. So we have to do two things simultaneously. We have to do acrobatics and turn direction in midair. You have to go after and interrogate the best of what it means to be African and human at the same time. And then you also have to do it in a way that dignity meets indignity, that love praxis meets that brutality. These are the questions that Du Bois asked in The Ordeal of Mansart, which is a very key reading that we should go after. So it's righteous work, it's hard work, but it's the right work. It's a chore, but it's the right chore. And it is something you got to be in it to win it. And we have to be in it for the long haul. You have to do it, brother love, when you're not going to be given a ribbon or an accolade or a trophy. No, this is why you're doing it. There's something called propriety. Propriety means doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. No one is acknowledging you. Your name is not in lights. Okay. Dr. Cofield is not giving you a blue ribbon or nothing like that. No, but you're doing this because it needs doing and that it is the right thing to do. So if we can show up like that, I believe we have a chance and we can begin turning things around. I hope that satisfied your question.
Yeah,
Dr.
thank you
Risam,
very much. That was to the heart.
yes, thank you so much. I love how you talked about activating the heart and mind, and I'm just sitting here thinking about, a lot of times when we think about digital spaces, we think about it as disembodied and not, not necessarily activating hearts and minds, but that is our challenge. And I think that this is possible, and it is necessary for us to activate that space. And this provocation, this invitation to activate hearts and minds in digital spaces is important because of the amount, the amount of time that is, especially young people, when we talk about, learners, are spending in these digital spaces. We have, it's an opportunity as well for us to meet them where they are. Okay, so I see Dr. Agbo posted a question, and I think that will be our last question. I want to honor our speaker's time. So Dr. Agbo posted, shall we talk about Ubuntu as a starting point to introducing ourselves to our own history?
Yeah, I love that. Umuntu, igamuntu, igabantu. A person is a person because there are people. You know, we are because we are, you know. So I think that is a wonderful starting point. And it is something also that it's one of those things that it's like a gift that keeps on giving, right? And so there is, I think, a very necessary thing. I'm flashing back as a teacher educator just to how people are trained traditionally, and people teach how they were taught. So we oftentimes, excuse me, they show up and they will want to invoke a bunch of rules and stuff like that in the classroom and things of that nature. They want to give people their boundaries. But what if we thought about it as a village? And what if we thought about it from the perspective of Ubuntu, that we are here as a village and we are here to help the village. If we do harm, you've not just done harm to an individual, you've done harm to the village. And so now, instead of excommunicating you out, we have to now make you to understand, help you understand how you harm the village, and then we have to repair and then restore. So I think Ubuntu is a wonderful as a life pedagogy. That's something I call a living practice text, and it is definitely something that I think also it cuts across generation, it cuts across space and time. It was good 500 years ago. It's good today. Mhm.
All right. Well, you both have been a gift. Speaking of gifts, you both have been a gift to us today. I want to thank you so much for the time that you have spent in preparation and that you have spent sharing space with us. As we close, today reminds us that pedagogy and digital humanities are not neutral endeavors. They are shaped by culture, memory, and ethical responsibility. Across African-centered frameworks and post-colonial digital practice, we've been invited to think carefully about where we begin, how we build, and what kinds of futures our choices make possible. I want to remind everybody about tomorrow's session as we continue this conversation, turning our attention to institutional practice and public memory with colleagues from the Smithsonian Institution, who will help us think about digital humanities education and access at scale. Thank you to our illustrious speakers for their intellectual generosity, and thank you all for staying in this work with care and intention and for inspiring us as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
the students are clapping. You can't hear them, but they're clapping in the room.